the United States federal government will resume capital punishment for the first time in 16 years. Attorney General William Barr, who is Catholic, instructed the Bureau of Prisons last week to schedule executions starting in December for 5 men, all accused of murdering children. This ends an informal moratorium on executions at the federal level. The Catechism of the Catholic Church's teaching on the death penalty was updated last year with a statement from Pope Francis calling the death penalty, quote, inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. For trusted Catholic analysis on this news, we are joined now by Dr. Matthew Bunson, a historian, theologian, and senior contributor for EWTN News. Dr. Bunson, welcome back to the show.
Always great to be with you.
First off, can you clarify the Church's teaching on capital punishment? It was revised as recently as last year.
Just last year, in fact, in 2018, Pope Francis tightened up the language of the Catechism. I remember having a great discussion with you and Father Thomas Petrie on this very topic. The Holy Father, building on the work of the most recent of popes, in particular Pope St. John Paul II, who issued a revision to the Catechism in 1997 that described capital punishment as rare, if not non-existent. In other words, we are moving away from our traditional understanding of it, but while still accepting the right of the state to use capital punishment. Pope Francis introduced the term inadmissible. That the death penalty should now be considered inadmissible because it's a violation of the dignity of the human person. But there were a couple of other fine points that we need to really be clear of. The first is that in the paragraph that was revised in 2267 in the Catechism, he stresses a deeper understanding now of the dignity of the human person, especially in the modern world. He also notes the advances in our understanding of the penal system. In other words, we have ways of preventing crimes, but also with dealing with criminals humanely. The other really pertains to an understanding of the way that we can lead people, hopefully, to redemption, to reform. And that, in a way, is the kickoff point for a lot of the discussion that's followed with William Barr's decision.
Absolutely. And these 5 criminals who are scheduled for execution have committed truly horrific crimes. There are victims, real victims, in each case. So what do you say, Dr. Bunson, to Catholics who feel conflicted on whether or not capital punishment truly is justice for these cases?
Well, there is always a longing for justice. There are crimes that cry out for justice, as always been said. The Catechism itself, as I was just noting, stresses the importance of the idea of redemption, of trying to bring people to reform. Pope John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae in chapter 9 describes the fact that even a murderer does not lose his innate dignity. And he frames that within the discussion of Cain and Abel. And he says that God made a sign of this. In other words, he set Cain apart to avoid having him killed. He then also uses a quote from St. Ambrose, who goes to mercy, the combination, the balance that we have to have of mercy and justice. And so that's, in many ways, what John Paul II was getting at in his change in 1997. But we're seeing that also in the language of Pope Francis. When he addressed Congress in 2015, he talked about the fact that we need to have that room for possible reform of the human person who has committed these crimes. And then in the statement from the USCCB, Bishop Frank Duane, who's representing the conference, talks about the same thing, about we have to balance that mercy and justice. So I can understand why people have this longing for justice, but we have to understand as well what the Catechism is asking of us.
Attorney General William Barr is Catholic and is being widely criticized for this decision. Does this criticism compare to that of lawmakers who are advancing a pro-abortion legislation?
Well, in the statement from the Justice Department announcing the resumption of the use of capital punishment, the Attorney General, who is essentially the highest lawyer in the land, made an important distinction. He said that this is the completion of an investigation, of a review of the process that dates all the way back to 2014 and the botched execution, as you'll recall, that took place that really was quite a bit of a scandal across the United States. So the review was completed, and so with that review completed, he green-lighted the resumption of the death penalty. That's important because I go back to the fact that when he was in his confirmation hearings, a lot of people were asking, would William Barr have his faith interfere with his fulfillment of his duties as Attorney General. Was the fact that he's Catholic going to somehow disqualify him from his task? We see in this decision, clearly not. He has made this decision. But now we're also seeing many critics saying, well, should he now be barred from communion in exactly the same way that Catholic politicians who support abortion?
Right.
They are, of course, qualitatively different, because the death penalty does not rise to the level of an intrinsic evil. It remains the right of the state in exactly the same way that abortion is intrinsically evil. So to try to compare those two sets of public figures, I think, is a fallacy, but it's also a trap, the trap of the seamless garment that tries to look at everything holistically in terms of the pro-life movement, but does not differentiate among those things that are intrinsically evil and those things that are subject to prudential judgments where we can have disagreements over policy.
That is an incredibly important distinction. So finally, Dr. Bunson, given this recent news, how do you view the current administration when it comes to the pro-life issue?
Well, back in 2016, I know we were all covering it here at EWTN.
Right.
We had a lot of concerns about how exactly and would Donald Trump be authentically pro-life. In the years that have followed, we have seen his appointment of a number of pro-life justices, a number of pro-life judges. We have seen a number of enactments on the part of the administration, the Mexico City policy. We're not going to agree with every administration. Being Catholics, and this is something I know you talk about all the time, being Catholics does not mean that we adhere to one political party.
Right.
And that is certainly the case here. We are going to have disagreements with any administration in exactly the same way that we will support any administration that is searching for the common good. In this case, supporting the authentic pro-life movement, in particular, doing everything we can to build a culture of life that reduces abortion.
Dr. Matthew Bunson, senior contributor for EWTN News, thank you so much for being here and giving us this insight in this incredibly important news story. Really grateful.
Always a joy to be with you.
Thank you.